Tehran says the Strait of Hormuz is about to reopen, yet Houthi missiles slam Yemeni forces and Israeli reservists fall in southern Lebanon, so the deal is either a breakthrough or a smokescreen. While diplomats draft the text, North Korea test fires a ballistic missile and sends a missile unit toward Russia, and Ukrainian drones torch a major refinery deep inside Russian territory. We start with the Hormuz Agreement. The choke point every tanker must pass is the story that moves markets first. Is the Strait of Hormuz about to reopen, or is Tehran selling a diplomatic mirage? Iranian and Omani officials say they are in the final stage of drafting an agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, according to reporting by The Guardian, Al Jazeera, the BBC, and The War Zone. The deal would put the waterway, the choke point that handles a large share of global oil and LNG shipments, under a shared Iranian-Omani arrangement, and Tehran is presenting it as a diplomatic win, even as the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran continues. The Guardian's live blog notes that Iranian state media first announced the breakthrough, and multiple international outlets have now picked up the claim, though none have seen the text. What changed in the last 24 hours is the specific framing. Yesterday, the story was a coup-d'etat draft, circulating and President Donald Trump calling a deal imminent. Today, Tehran says the text with Oman is nearly finalized, while the Trump administration pushes back against reports that the war has drained U.S. missile stockpiles. Fox News Digital reports that administration officials rejected those depletion claims, which matters because if Washington is signaling it still has strike capacity, the Hormuz diplomacy is happening under coercive pressure rather than from a position of American weakness. The ripple effects are immediate. Any reopening protocol changes insurance premiums for tankers, the routing decisions of LNG carriers, and the price of Brent crude, because roughly 1/5 of globally traded oil moves through this strait. A sustained closure would force Gulf producers to look at pipeline alternatives and push Asian buyers toward other suppliers, while a managed reopening would hand Iran leverage over who transits and under what terms. Diplomatically, the deal elevates Oman as the indispensable intermediary and tests whether Saudi Arabia and the UAE accept an Iranian role in policing the waterway they depend on. The military picture is different. The agreement does not stop the Houthi campaign in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, where the group claimed fresh attacks on Saudi-linked tankers and Yemeni government positions today. The Jerusalem Post reports that Houthi missile attacks on emergency forces camps in Marib and Hadramaut claimed the lives of at least 30 Yemeni government troops, and the U.S. Mission to Yemen called the attacks another example of Houthi terrorism against the Yemeni people. Shipping traffic has already slowed in Hormuz and Bab al-Mandab after the Houthi tanker claims, according to maritime trackers cited by the Jerusalem Post. What the move signals is that Iran is trying to convert battlefield pressure into negotiating currency. By offering to reopen Hormuz through an Omani partnership, Tehran can claim it is the responsible steward of the waterway, while still threatening to close it again if talks fail. The Trump administration's simultaneous pushback on stockpile rumors suggests the White House wants to avoid the appearance that strikes have forced it to bargain from weakness. The real question is whether Israel and the United States have signed off on the terms, or whether Iran and Oman are announcing a bilateral arrangement that Washington still has to accept. The trajectory forks in two directions. If the deal is finalized and tankers begin moving under a verified protocol, the next 48 hours could see a measurable drop in regional tensions and a stabilization of energy markets. If hardliners in Tehran, the IRGC, or the Houthis stage an attack on a tanker or Saudi facility while the ink is still wet, the deal collapses and the air campaign resumes. The tell that distinguishes them is simple. Watch whether commercial shipping traffic through Hormuz actually rises before any announcement is hailed as a success. And while diplomats draft the Hormuz text, the ceasefire in southern Lebanon has just recorded its first Israeli losses since June. While diplomats draft a Hormuz deal, the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon has just recorded its first Israeli losses since June. The Israel Defense Forces said this morning that 2 reservists were lost and 4 others were seriously injured in an explosion inside southern Lebanon, making this the most serious incident for Israeli forces since the fragile truce took effect. Haaretz, The Guardian, and the BBC all report that the blast occurred in an Israeli-held sector of the border area, and that it comes amid another round of Israel-Lebanon talks, described in relatively positive terms before today. What is still unverified is the critical detail. Israeli officials are investigating whether the device was left behind from earlier fighting, or whether Hezbollah fighters crossed the line and planted it, which would mean a deliberate ceasefire violation and a major security breach. Hezbollah has not claimed responsibility, and the group's media have not acknowledged the incident in the same terms as the IDF. The consequences are large. 2 Israeli reservists lost in a single incident is a politically painful event for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government, which has already faced pressure over the Gaza war and the handling of the northern border. The explosion also lands in the middle of U.S.-mediated talks in Rome, where the two sides had been discussing the terms of a more durable arrangement. If Hezbollah managed to infiltrate IDF lines and plant the device, the incident becomes evidence that the militant group can still operate inside Israeli-controlled territory, despite months of strikes and the June truce. If the device was simply left over from earlier combat, the risk is lower but still serious, because it shows that the border area remains seeded with unexploded ordnance that can reshape politics. The ripple effects run in several directions. For Israel, the event strengthens the hand of officials who want a harder line in Lebanon and who argue that the army should not withdraw from forward positions. For Hezbollah, a successful penetration, if confirmed, would be a propaganda victory that restores some credibility after the heavy losses of last year, but it would also invite Israeli retaliation. For the United States, the timing is terrible. Washington is trying to keep the Iran file and the Lebanon file on separate tracks, and an incident that links Hezbollah to an Israeli loss makes that separation harder. Regionally, any return to large-scale exchanges across the Blue Line would put northern Israeli communities back under alert and threaten the offshore gas infrastructure that both sides have an interest in keeping quiet. What to watch next is straightforward. The IDF has already struck southern Lebanon in response, and the question is whether the response stays limited or escalates into a broader round of strikes and rocket fire. Hezbollah's silence today is itself a signal. The group may be calculating whether to deny, claim, or simply absorb the blame. The Rome talks are the other pressure point, because if Israel links the incident to the negotiation, the diplomatic track could freeze just when it seemed to be gaining momentum. The two plausible paths are clear. Either Israel retaliates heavily and the June truce collapses, or both sides treat the explosion as a tragic but containable event and keep talking. The tell will be the scale of the Israeli strike package in the next 24 hours. And while Israel weighs its response in Lebanon, North Korea has just test-fired a ballistic missile toward the sea. If the Middle East is trying to negotiate its way out of one war, the Korean peninsula is signaling it may be heading deeper into another posture. North Korea test-fired at least one short-range ballistic missile toward the sea on Thursday, according to South Korea's Joint Chiefs AP, NBC News, Kyoto, and U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. The launch landed outside Japan's exclusive economic zone, and no damage was reported in Japan, but the timing is the message. It comes days before the United States and South Korea begin major drills and on the anniversary of the Hiroshima strike. NBC News notes that Pyongyang has been focused on enlarging its nuclear and missile arsenals since Kim Jong-un's summit diplomacy with then-President Donald Trump collapsed in 2019. And the Japan Times reports that North Korea vowed to pursue additional military options in response to Tokyo's growing defense capabilities. What changed from yesterday is the combination of the test with the explicit threat. A single short-range launch is not unusual, but pairing it with a statement that more options are on the table turns a routine provocation into a policy signal. The U.S. Indo-Pacific Command said it is consulting closely with allies and partners, and that the launch poses no immediate threat, which is the standard reassurance language, but also an acknowledgement that Washington is tracking a pattern, not an isolated event. South Korean and Japanese officials are almost certainly watching whether the next launch uses a solid fuel engine or a new maneuvering re-entry vehicle, because either would show a step up in capability. The ripple effects are Indo-Pacific-wide. For Japan, the launch reinforces the argument that Tokyo needs counterstrike options and larger defense spending. For South Korea, it arrives just as Seoul is deepening trilateral cooperation with Washington and Tokyo, and any North Korean test becomes a reason to accelerate missile defense and intelligence sharing. For the United States, the test is a reminder that the Pentagon has to resource both the Middle East and the Pacific simultaneously, and that every missile North Korea fires is one less system it can hand to Russia. China is the silent variable. Beijing does not want a collapsed North Korea, but it also benefits from a Pyongyang that keeps U.S. forces tied down and distracted. The War Zone and Kyiv Post both report that North Korea is deepening missile cooperation with Russia, so a test in the Pacific and a shipment to the European theater may be two sides of the same production line. What the launch signals is that Kim Jong-un is not waiting for diplomacy. Since 2019, he has shifted from summit bargaining to arsenal expansion, and this test fits that doctrine. The Hiroshima anniversary timing is a deliberate message to Japan, while the pre-drill timing is a message to the U.S.-ROK alliance. The real question is whether the missile is the opening act for a larger exercise, perhaps a nuclear test, a satellite launch, or another shipment of artillery and missiles to Russia, or whether Kim is simply calibrating pressure before the drills begin. If the launch is followed by more tests, or by a confirmed transfer of missile systems to Russia, the crisis escalates and Seoul and Tokyo will accelerate their military buildup. If the test is the only move and Pyongyang returns to rhetoric, the Allies may treat it as seasonal pressure and keep the door closed but not bolted. The tell is what happens after the U.S. South Korea drills start. More launches mean escalation, silence means calibration. And while the Pacific launch grabs attention, the same North Korea may be sending a missile unit all the way to Russia's Voronezh region. The same North Korea that just tested a missile may also be preparing to operate inside Russia. Ukrainian intelligence warns that Pyongyang may deploy a missile unit to Russia's Voronezh region for strikes on Ukraine, according to Kyiv Post, the War Zone, and Meduza. The deployment would mark a significant expansion of military cooperation between Moscow and Pyongyang, which has already supplied Russia with artillery shells, troops, and ballistic missiles. What is still unverified is whether the unit has actually arrived, what missile systems it would operate, and whether the Russian Ministry of Defense has formally signed off on the arrangement. Ukrainian sources used the word may carefully, and no independent satellite imagery has yet been cited in the open-source reporting we have seen. What changed from yesterday is the specificity of the location. Earlier reporting described North Korean troops and missiles flowing into Russia in general terms. Today, the warning points to Voronezh, a region just north of the Ukrainian border that has already been used as a launch point for strikes on Ukraine. That geography matters because it shortens the targeting loop. Missiles fired from Voronezh can reach deeper Ukrainian targets with shorter warning times, and North Korean crews operating there would gain direct combat experience against Western-supplied air defenses. The move also suggests Russia is running short of its own long-range missile stocks, because outsourcing strike missions to an allied missile unit is not something a force with ample domestic capacity would typically do. The War Zone notes that North Korea upping ballistic missile supplies would be bad news for Ukraine at the worst time, because Kyiv is already struggling to secure enough interceptors. Here is the angle mainstream coverage is underweighting. Russian military bloggers and official channels are not celebrating this deployment, because framing North Korean missile crews as the solution to Russia's strike problem admits that Russian missile production is struggling to keep pace with demand. Ukrainian sources, meanwhile, are careful to say the unit may deploy rather than has deployed, which means the gap between intention and arrival is the real question. Both sides are using the story for leverage. Moscow wants to signal that its arsenal is deep, while Kyiv wants to signal that Russia is so stretched it is importing missile units. The ripple effects cross two continents. In Europe, the deployment would force Ukraine to allocate more air defense interceptors to the northern axis and would raise questions about whether NATO should treat North Korean crews as legitimate military targets inside Russia. In Asia, it would confirm for Seoul and Tokyo that the Ukraine war is no longer a European problem, because a North Korean unit fighting in Russia returns combat data, payments, and prestige to Pyongyang. For defense markets, the story accelerates demand for missile defense and long-range strike systems in both theaters. If the unit arrives and conducts strikes, the Ukraine war gains an explicit Indo-Pacific participant, and the response from Seoul and Tokyo becomes a major variable. If the deployment stays ambiguous or limited to supplies and advisors, Russia keeps the capability while avoiding the political cost of foreign uniformed crews striking Ukraine. The tell is satellite imagery. Watch for North Korean missile transporters, launchers, or support vehicles near Voronezh in the coming days. And while Pyongyang's possible deployment is tracked, Ukrainian drones have just struck a major refinery in Yaroslavl, deep inside Russia. While North Korea's missiles get the headlines, Ukrainian drones are rewriting the geography of the war inside Russia. President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukrainian drones struck 2 Russian oil refineries in the latest long-range attack, and the Kyiv Independent identifies one target as the Slavneft-Yanos refinery in Yaroslavl, more than 700 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. The plant sits northeast of Moscow and processes enough crude to matter to both domestic supply and export revenue. The BBC and Meduza report a huge smoke plume over the city and local reports of a major refinery fire, while Russian officials say several people were lost in attacks across Bryansk, Nizhny Novgorod, and Kursk. What is unverified is the extent of damage at the Yaroslavl plant itself, whether it was hit for a second consecutive night, and whether the casualty figures from other regions are tied to this specific strike package or to the broader exchange. What changed from yesterday is the depth and the target set. Ukraine has struck inside Russia before, but hitting one of Russia's 5 largest refineries, with an annual crude capacity of 15 million metric tons, on a second night running, shows a sustained campaign against Russian energy infrastructure rather than a one-off demonstration. The Slavneft-Yanos plant is in the Yaroslavl region, well inside the Moscow time zone and far from the front, which means Ukrainian drones are getting through layered Russian air defense over long distances. That distance puts it beyond most short-range drones and suggests the use of either modified long-range systems or new supply lines from partners. Meduza quotes the local governor, calling it the largest drone attack on the Yaroslavl region, a claim that is unverified but consistent with the scale of recent Ukrainian operations. The BBC Live blog also notes that the war is now in its 5th year, a reminder that both sides are fighting a long war of attrition where infrastructure is as much a target as territory. The ripple effects are economic and military. Russian refining capacity is the bottleneck that turns crude into diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel for both the civilian market and the army. Repeated hits force Russia to choose between repairing civilian plants and protecting military targets. Every refinery fire also tightens global refined product markets, because Russia is a major exporter of diesel and fuel oil, and any sustained loss of output puts upward pressure on prices that European and Asian consumers feel. The ruble and Russian insurance markets are sensitive too, because the more successful the strikes, the more Moscow has to spend on air defense, and the less it can spend elsewhere. For Ukraine's allies, the strikes are also a form of accountability. Every refinery hit is revenue Russia cannot use to buy more missiles. What the campaign signals is that Ukraine is shifting resources towards strategic depth at a moment when the front line has been relatively static. By striking 700 kilometers deep, Kyiv demonstrates that Russian rear areas are not safe, which erodes the narrative that the war is contained to the border regions. It also tests whether Russia will retaliate by escalating strikes on Ukrainian energy sites, or whether Moscow's air defense gaps are too large to close quickly. The real question is whether Ukraine has enough drones and targeting data to keep the pressure up, or whether this is the peak of a temporary surge. If Russia responds with a large missile and drone barrage against Ukrainian power plants and refineries, The war returns to the winter energy war pattern that caused blackouts last year. If Russia absorbs the losses and diverts air defense assets to the rear, the front line may stay quieter, but Russian logistics and fuel supplies will suffer. The tell is the next Russian strike package. If it is aimed at Ukrainian energy rather than troop positions, Moscow has chosen retaliation over adaptation. That choice sets up the next 24 hours. Here is what to watch. Here is what to watch in the next 24 hours. First, the Hormuz deal. Look for the first commercial tanker convoys moving under any new protocol, for a Trump statement that either confirms the timeline or adds conditions, and for any Houthi attack that could collapse the diplomacy before it starts. Second, southern Lebanon. The scale of Israel's retaliatory strike, any Hezbollah statement, and the status of the Rome talks will tell you whether the June truce survives or frays. Third, the Korean Peninsula. Watch for a second North Korean launch after U.S. South Korea drills begin, and for any satellite imagery of North Korean missile gear near Voronezh. Fourth, Ukraine's deep strike campaign, the next Russian response. Whether it targets Ukrainian energy, troop positions, or stays quiet, will reveal whether Moscow chooses retaliation or adaptation. If you found this briefing useful, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss a daily worldwide conflict update. We will be back tomorrow with the next brief. See you tomorrow.